My research project, my senior year thesis, was about how the United States Supreme Court answers First Amendment free exercise clause questions that arise from Native American communities, and how does the court's treatment of those claims compare to its treatment of other religions, specifically Christianity and other theistic religions. So to answer this question, my paper explored three primary cases: Bowen v. Roy, Ling v. Northwest Cemetery Protected Association, and Employment Division versus Smith. These cases all arise out of Native American free exercise clause claims, and each is still treated as good controlling law to this day. Throughout the review of these cases, I compared the reasoning and the outcomes to comparable cases that arose from free exercise claims raised by members of theistic religions, primarily Christianity. It'll become clear to you throughout these cases that a disparity exists between the treatment of Native American religions and Christianity. This disparity persists to this day and is caused by a tendency of the court to apply precedent from Native American cases to Native American cases, and from theistic cases to other theistic cases, whether or not those comparisons provide the most comparable facts and law. So the first case that I reviewed is Bowen versus Roy. This case is from 1986, and in this case, a member of the Abenaki tribe in Pennsylvania applied for food stamp benefits for his daughter, Little Bird of the Snow, under Pennsylvania's Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. These programs required recipients of benefits to provide their Social Security number to the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare. The plaintiff in this case objected, stating that the use of the Social Security number as an identifier, coupled with other uses of the number over which she has no control, will serve to, quote, rob the spirit of his daughter and prevent her from attaining greater spiritual power. Because of this objection, Roy sued the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare under the First Amendment. The court in this case ruled against Roy. In its holding, the court stressed that the Social Security numbers are used for internal record-keeping purposes, for identification and record-keeping, and it's an internal government process that outside parties can't determine or tell the government how to conduct their internal operations. The next case, Ling v. Northwest Cemetery Protected Association, builds on the first case, and the disparity is possibly best exemplified in this case. In Ling, the U.S. Forest Service planned to construct a logging road through an area called Chimney Rock, which is a sacred site for Native Americans in the Huba Valley Indian Reservation. It's hard to understate the impact that this logging road would have on the plaintiffs in this case. It would, quote, physically destroy the environmental conditions and the privacy without which the religious practices cannot be conducted. It's uncontested by the majority and dissent in this case that if this logging road is constructed, it would completely obliterate these natives' ability to practice their religion at all. However, despite this, the court ruled against the Native American free exercise claim, relying on Bowen versus Roy, despite these cases not being very comparable in any other way other than both cases arose from Native American religious contexts. It's obvious that as opposed to the internal record-keeping system at issue in Bowen, the issue in Ling is not so tight. It is the Forest Service paving a road and then subsequently conducting logging operations in a sacred area, which is by no means an internal government operation. It has significant external effects. The court fails to recognize those differences in this case, and thus it doesn't take into account different cases that I argue should have been used as precedent, cases that arose out of Christian contexts that ruled in favor of the free exercise claim. Those cases are Sherbert v. Werner and Wisconsin v. Yoder. Yoder arose from a Christian context. It was a 1972 case in which the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the conservative Amish Mennonite Church and Old Order Amish, who declined to send their children to school after they graduated from 8th grade. This violated a Wisconsin law that required school attendance by all children until they reached the age of 16. The Amish communities in this case claimed that this violated their free exercise rights and sued under the First Amendment. Yoder relied on the test created in Sherbert v. Verner, known as the Sherbert test, which requires the court that when a government action places significant burden on the free exercise of religion, to determine whether or not there is a compelling government interest that overrides the free exercise claim. And that's a very high burden on the government. It's very hard for the government to have a claim that is important enough to override the First Amendment. So the court in Yoder said, in order for Wisconsin to compel school attendance beyond the 8th grade against a claim that such attendance interferes with the practice of a legitimate religious belief, it must appear that there is a state interest of sufficient magnitude to override the interest claiming protection under the Free Exercise Clause. The court in Yoder found that the government interest in an educated populace and requiring education was not sufficient, and ruled in favor of the Amish communities, saying that this law that the Amish parents were convicted under violates the First Amendment in that context. Obviously, if this rule were applied in Lynn, the court would reach the same conclusion. The interest in a logging road that has multiple other viable routes could not possibly outweigh the religious freedom interest. But the court chose to simply not apply that rule at all. There's no burden placed on the state in Lynn whatsoever. By relying on Bowen instead of Sherbert and Yoder, the court bypasses this issue and creates two separate lines of precedent depending on the religion of the plaintiffs. The final case I reviewed is Employment Division of the Department of Human Resources of Oregon versus Smith. This case is from 1990. In this case, Native American plaintiffs, once again, were fired from their jobs because they, quote, ingested peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, for sacramental purposes at a ceremony of their Native American church. After their firing, Smith and Black, the plaintiffs, applied for unemployment benefits and were denied on the grounds that they were discharged for misconduct under an Oregon law that prohibited the possession of these controlled substances. They sued, claiming that this law and the denial of unemployment benefits violated the First Amendment and their free exercise rights. The court, however, ruled against the religious freedom interest in this case, relying on and expanding the rulings in Bowen and Lynn. Essentially, the rule set forth in this case is that, quote, valid and neutral laws of general applicability do not violate the First Amendment even if they place a substantial burden on an individual's free exercise of religion. This is a significant expansion from previous cases, such as Yoder, which previously held that exceptions to neutral, generally applicable laws can be made in instances where individuals' ability to exercise their religion is severely burdened. The Smith court also makes the same mistake as Ling. It heavily relies on Ling and Bowen instead of looking at other cases from different religious contexts. The court in Employment Division versus Smith says, in Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association, we declined to apply Sherbert analysis to the government's logging and road construction activities on lands used for religious purposes by several Native American tribes, even though it was undisputed that the activities could have devastating effects on traditional Indian religious practices. So because the court, I argue, inappropriately declined to apply the Sherbert test in Ling, now the court in Employment Division versus Smith does the same thing, relying simply on Ling, instead of going back and looking at other Christian cases that would have led them to a different conclusion. Because the court relies on this faulty precedent, which failed to apply the Sherbert test due to its own misapplication of precedent in Bowen, it ignores relevant unemployment and criminal cases that do apply the Sherbert test, such as Hobby v. Unemployment Appeals Commission, Thomas versus Review Board, and of course, Wisconsin versus Yoder. And now, it would be one thing if the rule laid out in Smith that prohibiting free exercise of religion, if it's the effect of a generally applicable law, the First Amendment has not been offended. Were applied evenly by courts in future cases, we might be okay. It was possible for courts to apply the rule from Employment Division equally across religious contexts and solve the discrepancy that existed between these two religious contexts. Of course, that is not the world we live in. The last case we'll compare to these other cases is Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, which was decided in 2014. In this case, which was raised by the Christian owners of the retail chain Hobby Lobby, they sued over an Affordable Care Act requirement to provide health insurance options to cover certain contraceptives. Despite some differences in the facts, the principle at the center of this case remains very similar to the principles in Employment Division versus Smith and Bowen versus Roy. This is a religious person claiming that a valid, generally applicable law that is completely neutral violates their right to freely exercise their religion. This leaves the court with a couple of options. They can overturn Smith, or at a minimum, clarify that the rule in Smith is incompatible with a new law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to rule in favor of Hobby Lobby. Or they could continue with the precedent of the time, regardless of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In a 5-4 decision authored by Samuel Alito, the court chose a third, far more ridiculous option, and ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby without in any way overturning or saying that Smith and these other cases that led to Smith were invalid or affected in any way by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So that is now what we're left with today. We have Bowen, Ling, and Smith applying to Native American religious freedom claims, and a completely separate line of cases from Sherbert to Hobby Lobby that apply to Christian religious freedom claims. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, Bowen, Ling, and Smith are all still considered good law to this day. And this is made most important by Apache Stronghold versus United States. This is a case that is currently pending before the Supreme Court. It is a case in which is remarkably similar to Ling. In this case, Apache Stronghold represents members of the San Carlos Apache tribe, to whom a place called Oak Flat is of significant religious importance. The government owns part of this land and wants to sell the land to a company called Resolution Copper, who wants to mine this area for copper and completely destroy the religious significance of the area. Once again, no party contests that it would completely destroy the Native Americans' ability to practice their religion on this land. This case was recently decided in the Ninth Circuit against the Native American religious freedom claim. The Ninth Circuit relied on, you guessed it, Bowen, Ling, and Smith to reach that decision, instead of, once again, looking at other Christian cases such as Hobby Lobby that could have helped them reach a decision favorable to the Native American religious freedom interest. So this is where we are. The court is still deciding whether or not they will take this case. They've talked about it in conference as recently as last week. So we're still waiting to see if the Supreme Court will revisit this line of cases or let it stand as it is with the disparity that exists. So in conclusion, the court would often reach better conclusions in Native American free exercise cases by conducting a more thorough analysis of not just precedent from Native American religious freedom cases, but of all relevant precedent, regardless of the religious context it arises out of. However, instead of conducting this thorough analysis, the court's tendency to sequester precedent based on what religious context it arose out of leads to an unequal treatment of Native American free exercise claims at the court. Thank you very much.
Questions for Charlie?
Not a question, but a compliment. You have such a strong speaker voice. You had me throughout the whole presentation very much locked in. I appreciate that. There was nothing that was too verbose or straight to the point, and I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Tate?
So, have you noted that in contemporary Christian cases, Sherbert is like the only test that's used, or this Smith doesn't come up at all, or?
No, so it's a little strange. Smith overturns the Sherbert test, and then the Religious Freedom Restoration Act revitalizes it because the Congress at the time was afraid of that precedent being applied in Christian cases from Smith, which I don't think was really a concern based on how conservative the Supreme Court has become. But Congress was concerned that Smith's ruling that valid laws don't burden the First Amendment would be applied in Christian cases. And so the Congress passed RFRA, which said, no, valid, neutrally applicable laws can run afoul of the First Amendment if it substantially burdens religion, basically revitalizing the sort of Sherbert test in the form of a law. So it becomes a little weirder after RFRA.
So I just wanted to say, great presentation, and you make a really, really compelling case. So I just want to see if I'm reading ultimately you're arguing that there are two different precedences happening between these two religious contexts. So my question is, it seems like Burwell versus Hobby Lobby just seems to be like an arbitrary decision on the court not applying any kind of precedent whatsoever. Is that?
Not really. It's Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, as I think a weird decision in numerous ways. It also has issues with corporate free expression because Hobby Lobby is a corporation. But it talks about Smith, relies on it kind of going back to previous cases. I haven't read Hobby Lobby in a while now since I've written this paper, so I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly which cases it relies upon, but I can email.
No, I just wanted to see what that argumentation was. So, awesome, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, fantastic. What do you anticipate will be the outcome of this current case that's the Apache?
Yeah, Apache Stronghold v. U.S.
Stronghold.
I don't know. Native American rights right now are interesting because despite there being a very conservative majority on the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, one of the conservative justices, is surprisingly good on Native American rights and has ruled in past cases with liberals on Native American religious freedom, or not on religious freedom cases, but on other Native American cases. So it's possible that he could be one of the justices that votes to allow it to come to the Supreme Court. What happens when it gets there, I don't know.
I think that your paper will need to wait for Apache Stronghold.
I think so.
Because Hobby Lobby, I think it's weirder because of the whole thing about probably have corporation having the religious beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? But if you take that, if you assume that's true, then you apply the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? And then that makes sense.
Yeah.
How it came out.
Yes.
So you really need to see how, because if they don't use the same logic, right, on the Apache case, then you're gonna see there's some issue.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which as you correctly said, revives the Sherbert test, it was a majority of Americans claiming that the employment division versus Smith, which essentially was a decision against Native Americans, was a threat against religious freedom else everywhere, right? So they used that case to make this case correct.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think that's an interesting bit, right? And I think that whether or not Apache decides along the same lines is going to be key because it's going to really tell us where the court is.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, like right now, the Ninth Circuit has decided it, as I said, along the lines of Lang and Smith. But yeah, whether or not the Supreme Court takes it up and what they do with it will be very interesting.
Do we know the Ninth Circuit? How does it?
The Ninth Circuit is typically a very liberal circuit.
Okay. I haven't honestly read.
Yeah.
Are there any precedents in faiths other than Native American indigenous religions and Christianity that you looked at?
Not that I looked at least for this paper. I've also, for Dr. Scruggs' class, wrote a paper similar to this about Judaism that has different issues than Native American religious freedom does, and that Judaism and Christianity are very similar religions in a lot of ways. And so a lot of decisions that benefit Christianity will naturally benefit Judaism. But in cases where there's a Jewish religious freedom claim raised that doesn't also benefit Christianity, the court is less likely to rule in favor of that religious freedom claim.
I hope I didn't miss this in your presentation, but could you speculate on why the court would divide those precedents into Christianity and Native American religion?
I did not look in this paper at all into the motivations of individual justices. And there are some things that make me think, at least for some justices, that it's not entirely intentional. For example, Justice Wright was the sole dissenter in Bowen versus Roy, and then he was in the majority in Lane v. Northwest Cemetery Protection Association. So it depends on the justice. I don't know. I think that, especially in the more recent cases, such as Burwell, but again, I think that Burwell was technically rightfully decided, as Dr. Nunes said, on the RFRA issue. It's the corporate religious expression that's typically more at issue in Hobby Lobby. That makes a lot of critics, myself included, say that Hobby Lobby was a very poor decision. So it's hard to say what the motivation is. I don't think it's entirely intentional, at least for certain justices.
Can I have just one last quick one?
You can, it's right, yeah.
I think this concept of yielder, you can use that as an example of the court making decisions that are based on the perception of the religion itself as opposed to the religion. I don't know if you notice that. You want to speak to that? Because they talk about the Amish, too.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I have to say about that, but
No, it's just that in that case they say, we should give the Amish exemptions from this general rule. And it's, a lot of it is about religion, but a lot of it is because of this perception that the Amish, they're nice. And they treat their kids nicely and those kind of things. Which, the Amish are just people, right? They're bad Amish and good Amish and whatever, but there's a case where the court's make an exemption for religion based on some stereotypical view of the religion. So I think that's something that you could weave into the argument in terms of the court, right?
Yeah.
Some religions are nice and some are not so nice.
But I also, I think that maybe another thing you could, they are, of course, they have their inborn biases, but also no one, as far as I'm aware on the court, is a theologian, right? So the idea, they have all their ideas of what is being presented to them, that this is in a religious interest. But I'm not sure here are two theologians in the room. I don't know that a theologian would say a Christian is not allowed to decorate a cake with two male names on it. That is not, as I'm aware, in the Old or New Testament, right? So it's sometimes
It's
you're
in
also.
the New Testament.
It's right, you know what, I'm a Jew. I'm that's I'm going to dust there. Right, but it's so some of it is also, has to be about both, I think that's so interesting. A very typical idea of a religious community, but also buying into what is presented to them as religious interest without really coming to that as a cultural construct as opposed to a theological construct is I also think super interesting. And I'm sure they have neither expertise when it comes to native.
Yes, that's correct. And one of the challenges in a lot of these cases is, explaining sort of how important the cases are, is that it's hard to put Native American religious practices into theistic terms. They wouldn't even call them religious practices. It's more of a deeply ingrained culture, connection with nature. It differs based on what tribe you're a part of, where you're from. So it's very hard to put those beliefs into a context that people on the Supreme Court are familiar with. And that comes across in the decisions as well.
Charlie, this has been so fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have what I think in the YouTube world is called stolen valor of getting to put this onto Charlie, but I am not his advisor. But I think we're going to call your
Yes, Dr.
advisor.
Thompson made me promise that I would call him so that he could say
So
something.
he gets to say his piece as well. But while we're waiting, this was such a wonderful way to wrap up the symposium. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here. And
Yeah, Dr. Thompson, you want me to pick up the microphone?
we'll see how this goes. The technological first for us.
Okay, you're on speakerphone.
I'm on the microphone, okay. So, first of all, I just want to say, hey, I can't be there because it's really important what Charlie's done. And I've heard Charlie give this in another setting at a conference. And I just want to say what a great job he's done all year on this project. It's an important subject. It's important for our current social and political and religious climate. And so I'm looking for big things from Charlie next year and the next few years to come when he goes to the University of Texas. So congratulations, Charlie.